In the previous segment, I discussed various revolutions that have occurred around the globe in the last 400 to 500 years. And in each case, I argued that there was essentially some kind of restoration after the revolutionary period was over. I used a fairly long revolutionary period, so in some cases almost 100 years, to describe the rise of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet Union. But in every case, I argue that there's been a restoration. Charles II replaced his father, Charles I, after a 20 to 40 year revolution. The American colonial elite, representing people like Ben Franklin and George Washington, won the revolution. But they were members of the colonial elite, and they replaced other members of the colonial elite, the Tories, who fled the country. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France after the fall of Napoleon. So we went from Bourbon monarchs to Bourbon monarchs with a period of, say, 30 years in between. The Russian Revolution from 1917 until about 1990 was the longest of the revolutionary periods, but what did we end up? Well, we ended up with a democracy on paper, but the reality makes it look as though the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, behaved a lot like a czar would have behaved. And in the case of the Chinese, I'm going to argue that the Chinese mandarins who ran China in the name of the emperor, to be sure, but ran China for most of the imperial period, are now back. They left after 1912, but they have been restored with the coming to power of Deng Xiaoping, which is where I ended the last segment. Now, I want to look at the leadership of Deng Xiaoping and try to explain why I see it as a continuity and not a separation. Many people have talked about Deng Xiaoping and a new revolution. It's fine to talk about new revolutions, but it's not really very realistic because that makes it sound as if there's been yet an additional new transformation. Actually, there hasn't been. In fact, the word revolution is kind of strange. If you look at a dictionary definition of revolution, one of the definitions would be a complete revolution. So, in any given day, the Earth makes a revolution. And in any given year, the Earth can be said to be rotate or revolve around the sun. So there's a complete revolution. It comes back to where it started before. Never quite exactly the same spot, but almost a complete 360-degree revolution. I would say that's what's happened in China, that the kind of essential governmental structure that existed under the emperors now exists again in China under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping and those who followed after his death. What do they look like? Well, the existing government of China is a group of technocrats elected by an internal party election from the top reaches of the Communist Party. But that group that serves at the top of the Communist Party are essentially those who came to power with Deng Xiaoping or were elevated by Deng Xiaoping to high positions within the Communist Party. They have, to be sure, different constituencies, and those constituencies are represented in one way or another within the government. The military, the foreign ministry, the energy ministry, and so on. Each of the leaders of China is someone who's dependent on groups within the bureaucracy who assist their rise to the top. What are these people? Well, these people are technocrats. They're well educated, many of them engineering, and that becomes the new mantra. Instead of being able to recite Confucian classics in order to become scholar officials or mandarins in the court surrounding the emperor, we now have technocrats who talk about various technical issues and why various technical issues have to be followed. But these are essentially educated people in a core, a bureaucratic core at the center of the government, and they look to an enormous degree just like the kind of technocrats that existed before 1912. And what about the structure of the government as a whole? Well, there are divisions. divisions. There are provinces, there are counties, there are villages, there are cities. But these look a lot like centralized control. All of the power, insofar as we know, comes from the center and radiates outward to the provinces, to the counties, to the cities, to the villages, in very much the same way that power radiated out from the central government under the emperor. It's impossible to say that it's exactly the same, but it certainly looks very similar. What are the chances that you could declare the emperor to be an idiot? Oh, not good. If he heard about it, or if man who was close to him heard about it, and if they thought you were any kind of threat, you're going to face some harsh punishments. And what happens today? Well, if you threaten the central government, you're facing a harsh challenge. Sometimes even people who don't say anything critical of the central government, but seem to be a threat to the government, are harshly treated. There's a group of Buddhists called the Falun Gong. They look like a very traditional Buddhist group. Not perfectly Buddhist, but kind of a popularized notion. Because they're organized and because the central government is suspicious of organized groups, the Falun Gong has faced a lot of opposition. It's perfectly fine to be a Christian within China. I know I lived for a year in a building where there was a Christian church that met every Sunday. But because the leader of that church was not a minister, just a lay person who conducted services, because he wasn't any kind of organized threat, because his church didn't reach beyond a small handful of members, some of them Chinese, many of them Western, he was no threat to the regime and he was never shut down. Had he sought to create a larger church organization that spread beyond the city of Beijing, or perhaps even beyond the campus of Beijing University, he probably would have met some opposition. So what do we have here? We have a government that looks a lot like the previous government. So where's the change? Is it in the economic policies? No, they were all abandoned. The Maoist call for equality for everybody, which turned out to mean everybody was going to be equally poor, well, that's been abandoned in favor of the favorite slogan of Deng, get rich. If you get rich, how do you get rich? Well, you don't get rich through Maoist policies, so you abandon those policies, and what do you put in their place? You put free enterprise in their place? I think not. While the economy under the Chinese imperial system may be said to look like free enterprise in a certain sense, it was always a controlled free enterprise, a controlled capitalism, if you like, where the government maintained control of checkpoints. So the Chinese government today maintains control of checkpoints, particularly those having to do with imports and exports. They have tight control over the borders. That would be typical of the imperial regime, and it's typical of the regime today. Indeed, I suppose you could say that's typical of most governments who seek to control their own borders. But it's not free enterprise. Free enterprise would have a large amount of freedom and freedom from regulation, and that's not there. There are regulations. The regulations may be relaxed during many periods, but they're not permanently relaxed. They can be reimposed at any moment. What are some of the regulations? Well, some of the regulations involve the one-child policy. This was a product of the post-Mao regime. Mao was in favor of everybody having as many children as they could because of his belief, mistaken, that by having an incredibly huge population, you would always overwhelm everybody else. You probably could do that if you could feed them all, but Mao couldn't feed them because his economic system couldn't produce enough food for everyone. And periodic periods of want, if not outright famine, were typical of the Maoist regime. Deng sought to say, we're going to let the individual farmers produce as much as they can on family plots. Family plots? Isn't that what the Chinese imperial system used? It is exactly what they used. So what we found with the Dengist regime is an attempt to restore the Chinese economy to the state that it was in before the revolution of 1912. That's not a new revolution. That's a revolution that's gone full cycle, coming back to the kind of restoration that existed before. Now, is there room for evolution in China? Yes, I would argue that there has been room for evolution in China. Many of the practices that one would have considered quite hostile towards women have been removed. There once was foot binding. Foot binding was not removed by the communists. It was removed throughout the 20th century with a succession of campaigns that sought to end what was a crippling practice for women. It was a practice that was related to their belief that they couldn't be married unless they had teeny feet, and hence they agreed to foot binding. Indeed, some of those who had their feet bound resisted when the government sought to ban foot binding because they thought that would make them so unattractive they would never get married, and they desperately wanted to be married in order to fit in with Chinese society. Foot binding has been eliminated. It was eliminated by a succession of policies that were highly sensible. What about marriage and divorce? Well, marriage and divorce happened episodically, but in general there was no room for divorce. If there ever was room for divorce, it was the prerogative of men who had political power or financial resources that would allow them to end their marriages. Women would have had no option at all. In the 20th century, as early as Chiang Kai-shek's regime, there were periods in which the structure of marriage had loosened. It was officially loosened under Mao Zedong, although in many cases divorce continued to be hard to obtain. If you lived in a village and you wanted to divorce your wife, probably not. If you were a wife who was mistreated, no hope at all. Even under Mao, even under his new so-called equality for women. But as time has gone on, as economic practices have made it possible for women to have careers other than merely as housewives, the possibility of divorce has come about. Now, is that the product of a revolutionary act? I think not. I think it's the product of changing economic conditions. Let's look at another policy. Deng started a one-child policy in an attempt to curb what was an ever-accelerating growth of population. That policy was put into effect. It led to a lot of opposition, particularly in the countryside, where to have only one child was dangerous if that one child turned out to be a girl. In the countryside, where there was no Social Security, without a son to help parents in their old age, parents or married couples who had no children or who had only girls would be faced with periods in which they would be beggars or would face starvation without a son. So the one-child policy always had to be modified in some ways in the countryside. In the cities, the one-child policy worked fairly well. In fact, the size of families in the city system is often a nuclear family with only one child. But in the cities, there's a social network, a social security network that provides pensions and continued housing for people who work in factories. So the need to have a large number of children in order to have a large number of men is unnecessary. Economic changes, globalization, those things are evolutionary, and those have produced change in China. In fact, as China has become more prosperous, what's happened? Well, there's now a relaxation of the one-child policy, because as people got richer, if they wanted to have more children, they were able to afford those children. And the one-child policy has now been officially modified so that people can have more children. Still, the size of families is unlikely to reach the 8 to 10 to 12 children that were once commonplace in the Chinese countryside before the end of the imperial regime in 1912. What I'm suggesting here is that the changes that have occurred in China, and there have been changes in China, are gradual evolutionary changes, and they are most likely to last. As for the violent revolutions, well, they're just that. They kill a lot of people. But in the end, As the regime becomes tired of ongoing purges, killings, executions, they bring that to an end. It's evolution and not revolution that produces the most lasting changes. Hope, 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 hope.